Rain whispered softly against the tall glass windows of the penthouse, tracing slow rivers across the glittering reflection of New York's midnight skyline. Inside, silence reigned, a heavy, suffocating kind that clung to the chest. Ethan Ward stood near the window, his figure dark against the shimmer of the city below. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that no amount of wealth could fix. He had built a tech empire from nothing, a global network of innovation, power, and influence. Yet at 35, standing alone in his billion-dollar apartment, he felt like a king with no kingdom left to rule. On the marble coffee table lay the letter that had shattered his illusion of control. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory even now, stern and absolute. "You've built companies, Ethan, but you've built no life. You've forgotten what it means to love. If you remain unmarried by your next birthday, every cent of your inheritance will be donated to charity." "That is my final will," Ethan had scoffed when he first read it, but now, 30 days from that deadline, he wasn't laughing anymore. Love couldn't be built on a schedule. It couldn't be coded into existence like his algorithms. Yet the law firm had confirmed it. His grandfather's will was airtight. Either he married or he lost everything. He had no interest in gold diggers. The tabloids had already made sure that every woman in the city knew about his predicament. Proposals flooded his inbox daily, some from models, some from socialites, and some from people he didn't even remember meeting. His assistant had screened hundreds of calls, but none of them had been real. None of them felt like something that wouldn't collapse under the weight of truth. It was then, as he stood brooding by the window, that his attention was caught by a faint sound echoing from the hallway. A quiet, muffled sob, the kind that came from someone who had been trying not to cry for far too long. He turned slightly, his curiosity piqued. No one was supposed to be on this floor at this hour except for the cleaning staff. Downstairs, Lily Martinez was trying to steady her trembling hands as she scrubbed the kitchen counters for the third time that night. Her eyes were swollen from tears, but she didn't stop working. She couldn't afford to stop. Every dollar she earned was another breath of hope for her mother, whose failing kidneys needed surgery that insurance barely covered. Lily was 27, a hard-working single woman who had learned long ago that dreams were for those who had time to sleep. Her world was a cycle of work and worry, sunlight and exhaustion. The hospital had called again that evening. "Miss Martinez, the surgery deposit is still pending," the voice on the other end had said. "If we don't receive payment by next week, we'll have to delay the operation." The word delay had felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Her mother's condition was worsening by the day, and every second mattered. Lily's hands shook as she wiped a counter that was already spotless. She whispered to herself, "It's going to be okay, Mama. It has to be." Her voice cracked on the last word. That was when she realized someone was standing in the doorway behind her. "Ethan." She froze, the cloth in her hand still mid-motion. He had never spoken to her directly before. He was the kind of man whose presence filled the room even when he said nothing. His gaze was sharp, analytical, and unnervingly calm. "Miss Martinez," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "You've been working here for how long?" "Almost 2 years, sir," she replied softly, lowering her gaze. He nodded slowly. "And in that time you've never once asked for an advance, never missed a shift, never complained?" Lily hesitated. "It's my job, sir." "Yes," Ethan said, studying her. "But it's also something else." "I overheard your phone call earlier." Her eyes widened and her cheeks flushed with humiliation. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ward. That was personal. I didn't mean to." He raised a hand gently to stop her. "You don't need to apologize, but I think I can help you." For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. "Help me?" she repeated. He gestured for her to sit at the table, but she stayed standing, unsure what was happening. Ethan took a deep breath as though weighing every word. "I have a proposition," he said finally. "It's going to sound unusual, maybe even absurd. But it could solve both our problems." He told her everything, about the will, the deadline, the inheritance, and his need for a marriage that would last 7 months. When he was done, Lily just stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to marry you?" she whispered. "Yes," Ethan said simply. "For 7 months. It would be a legal arrangement, nothing more. You'd receive $500,000, enough to cover your mother's surgery and change your life. I need someone I can trust, someone who won't sell this story to the tabloids, Someone who won't play games, Lily's heart raced. This couldn't be real. Was this some kind of test? A cruel joke? Why me? She asked quietly. Because you're not like them, he replied. You've been here for years, invisible, working hard, never asking for anything. You're real. I don't need love, Miss Martinez. I just need time. 7 months. After that, you'll be free. The room fell into silence, the air thick with uncertainty. Lily's mind spun through every reason to refuse. Marriage wasn't a contract. It was sacred, and yet, her mother's life depended on money she didn't have. What choice did she truly have? If I say yes, she asked cautiously, what exactly would this arrangement involve? Ethan pulled a folder from his briefcase, thick with papers. You'll move into the penthouse. We'll attend business events, social gatherings, pretend to be a happily married couple in public. Privately, we'll live separate lives. You'll have your own suite, your privacy, and your independence. The contract protects you completely. Her throat tightened. And if someone finds out it's fake? They won't, Ethan said firmly. My lawyers have handled everything. Discretion is part of the agreement. Lily felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just a decision, it was a leap off a cliff. But as she thought of her mother lying in that hospital bed, her hand weakly clutching hers, she realized that sometimes survival demanded impossible choices. She took a deep breath, steadying her trembling voice. I'll do it. Ethan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then we have an agreement. That night, after signing the contract, Lily stood in front of the penthouse window, the same one Ethan had stared out of hours earlier. The city glittered like a sea of stars, but she felt small against it. She whispered to herself, For you, Mama, I'll survive this. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at her signature on the papers. He had gotten what he needed, a wife to secure his inheritance. But something about the look in her eyes unsettled him. There had been strength there and sadness. He didn't know it yet. But the woman he had chosen out of necessity was about to change everything he thought he knew about love, life, and what truly mattered. And for Lily, the maid who had become a wife by contract, this was just the beginning of a story that would test every limit of her heart and redefine what destiny really meant. The first morning after the contract was signed dawned cold and misty, with the kind of silver light that made the world look unreal. The rain had not stopped all night, and when Lily awoke in the guest suite of Ethan Ward's penthouse, for a moment she forgot where she was. The bed beneath her was softer than any she had ever known. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender and expensive detergent. The ceiling rose high above her like the roof of a cathedral, and through the glass walls the city stretched endlessly, wrapped in morning fog. For someone who had grown up in a small apartment with peeling paint and flickering lights, this was another universe. She sat up slowly, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, and pressed her palms together. She whispered the same prayer she said every morning, for her mother's health and safety. Only this time her words carried a tremor of guilt. She was no longer just Lily, the maid. She was Lily Ward, at least in name and paper, for the next 7 months. A contract wife to a man who didn't love her, but whose decision had already saved her mother's life. When she walked into the kitchen later that morning, dressed neatly in a pale blouse and simple trousers, she found Ethan already seated at the dining table, a tablet in hand and a steaming cup of black coffee beside him. His world seemed so calm, so perfectly ordered, it made her feel like an intruder in her own skin. He looked up briefly when she entered, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held the faintest glimmer of curiosity. Good morning, he said, his tone neutral yet unexpectedly gentle. Good morning, Mr. Ward, she replied automatically. He set down his tablet and raised an eyebrow. Ethan, he corrected. If we're going to make this believable, you should probably call me Ethan. She hesitated. The word felt strange on her tongue. Ethan, she repeated softly as though testing its weight. He gave a small nod of approval. We have a meeting this afternoon with my legal team to finalize the registration. After that, the press will be informed through controlled channels. My PR manager will draft a love story to make our marriage look natural. You'll need to memorize a few details. A love story, she murmured, half to herself. The irony of pretending to love a man she barely knew wasn't lost on her. Ethan stood and moved to the window, his back to her. The world doesn't need to know the truth, he said quietly. They only need to see what they expect. A man finally settling down and a woman who brought him back to life. Lily's heart skipped. The phrase was too poetic for him, she thought. Maybe it wasn't meant for her at all. Maybe it was just part of the script. Still, something about his voice lingered with her, a faint echo of loneliness that didn't belong to a man who had everything. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparation. The wardrobe consultant arrived with racks of designer clothes. The PR manager briefed Lily on her backstory as Ethan's former employee who had fallen in love with him during a business trip to Boston. Every detail was choreographed, every question rehearsed. Ethan watched it all from the side, his expression unreadable but his eyes occasionally softening when they met hers. That afternoon, they went to the courthouse. The marble halls were empty, save for the echo of their footsteps. Lily wore a simple cream dress, elegant but modest, while Ethan was in his usual tailored black suit. The judge who officiated the ceremony was discreet, the only witness being Ethan's lawyer. The words "I do" felt hollow on her lips, but when Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, a strange stillness settled between them. It was not love, not even affection, but a silent acknowledgement of the weight they were both carrying. As they stepped out of the courthouse, the cold wind swept through the city, scattering leaves along the sidewalk. For a fleeting second, Ethan glanced at her and smiled. A small, real smile that didn't belong to the billionaire tycoon or the careful negotiator. It was a human smile, almost vulnerable. "Welcome to our marriage," Annie said quietly. And for the first time since this began, Lily didn't feel like an employee. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their strange new life began to take shape. At first, their interactions were brief and formal, shared breakfasts in silence, polite small talk before social events. But as time went on, the boundaries between them began to blur in subtle ways. Ethan discovered that Lily had a dry sense of humor hidden beneath her quiet exterior, and Lily began to notice how often Ethan worked late, not out of necessity, but because solitude had become his only companion. There were nights when she would pass his office and find him sitting in the dark, staring at old photographs on his desk, a younger version of himself with his grandfather, both smiling genuinely. Those were the moments she saw the man behind the armor, the one who carried the burden of expectations heavier than his wealth. She would quietly leave a cup of tea by his door and walk away without a word. The next morning, she'd find the empty cup returned to the kitchen counter, a silent thank you in its place. The world outside, however, was not so kind. Once the news of their marriage broke, the tabloids erupted in speculation. Headlines screamed about the mysterious woman who had captured New York's most unattainable bachelor. Photographers camped outside the penthouse, desperate for a picture. Every time they stepped out together, for charity galas, business dinners, or family events, Lily could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the whispering questions. Who is she? What does she want? But through it all, Ethan stood by her side, always composed, always protective. When a journalist asked a particularly cruel question about her background, Ethan had simply placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "She's my wife. That's all you need to know." That one gesture had silenced the room and stirred something in Lily's heart she couldn't quite name. One evening, after a long charity event, they returned home in silence. The city lights glimmered beneath them as the elevator ascended to the penthouse. When the doors opened, Lily stepped out first, relieved to be away from the cameras. She slipped off her heels and exhaled. Ethan followed behind, loosening his tie. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She turned to face him. "I'm fine. Just tired of pretending." He studied her for a moment before saying quietly, "You're doing better than I expected." Her brows furrowed. "You thought I couldn't handle it?" "No," he said, his tone unreadable. "I thought it would break you. But you're stronger than most people I know." For a moment, their eyes met in the dim light of the hallway, and something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was recognition. A shared loneliness, a mutual respect. A quiet understanding that neither of them had asked for this, yet both were trying to make it work. That night, as Lily lay in her room staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes when he said those words. For the first time, she wondered what pain he hid behind his calm exterior. And deep inside, a dangerous thought took root. The thought that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Ethan Ward than the contract that had bound them together. Ethan, too, found himself restless. He walked past her door that night and paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could hear the faint hum of her favorite song playing from inside, a melody soft and sad. He didn't knock. Instead, he whispered to the empty hallway, "What are you doing to me, Lily?" Before turning away. Neither of them knew it yet, but the walls between them were beginning to crack. And in the quiet spaces between duty and desire, between appearances and truth, something fragile and real was starting to bloom. A connection that neither contract nor logic could define. The days ahead would test them both. Secrets would surface, the past would come calling, and the line between pretend and reality would blur until neither could tell where one ended and the other began. But for now, under the glow of the city lights and the soft rhythm of shared silence, two broken souls began to find something they hadn't dared to hope for, a reason to feel alive again. The rhythm of the penthouse had changed over the following months. What had once been a quiet, sterile palace of glass and silence had begun to feel in some strange way alive. The laughter that had once been foreign to those marble halls now echoed faintly through them, soft and hesitant, like sunlight finding its way through a storm. Lily was the reason for that change, though she didn't know it. Her presence had brought warmth to the cold edges of Ethan Ward's world, a world once defined by numbers, deadlines, and the loneliness that came from success too early and trust too late. By the third month of their contract marriage, both of them had grown used to the rhythm of pretending, but what neither realized was how dangerously real the pretense had become. What began as rehearsed smiles for the cameras and calculated handholds during public events had transformed into moments that felt spontaneous, effortless, and frighteningly genuine. The line between pretend and real was beginning to blur in ways neither of them could control. One chilly evening, the city lay draped in fog, the sky painted in shades of gray and silver. Ethan had just returned from a long day of meetings, exhaustion heavy in his posture, his tie loosened, the scent of rain clinging to his coat. He stepped into the living room to find Lily sitting by the fireplace, reading quietly, her hair falling loosely around her face. She looked up when she heard him, her expression soft but questioning. "You're home late," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a faint note of concern that she hadn't meant to reveal. "I lost track of time," he admitted, shrugging out of his jacket. "The investors are relentless this week." He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching her over the rim of the glass. "How was your day?" She smiled faintly. "Uneventful. I went to see my mother this afternoon. She's doing better. The doctors say the surgery was a success, though she'll need a few months of recovery." "That's good news," Ethan said quietly, and there was genuine relief in his tone. He had funded the surgery, of course, but he hadn't visited the hospital. It wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he didn't know how to face gratitude. It made him feel vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. Lily looked at him for a long moment before saying softly, "You've done more for me than I could ever repay. My mother keeps asking about you. She calls you her guardian angel." Ethan chuckled under his breath, setting his glass down. "I don't think I qualify as that." "Maybe not," Lily said gently. "But you've given her hope. And that's something money can't buy." Their eyes met across the room, and for a long moment neither spoke. There was something in that silence, a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of gratitude and connection. Then Ethan looked away first, clearing his throat. "We have a gala this weekend," he said, reverting to business. "It's for the Hayes Foundation. The press will be there. We'll need to be convincing." Lily nodded, though she could feel a familiar ache in her chest at the reminder that what they shared was only an illusion to the world. "Of course," she said simply. "Whatever you need." When the night of the gala arrived, Lily wore a gown the color of moonlight, simple, elegant, breathtaking. Ethan, in his tailored tuxedo, looked every inch the composed billionaire the world admired. But when he saw her descending the staircase, something in his chest tightened. She was no longer the quiet maid he had once ignored. She was radiant, confident, and so heartbreakingly human that it disarmed him completely. "You look—" He hesitated, the word caught in his throat. "Appropriate?" she teased, a faint smile tugging at her lips. He shook his head slightly. "Perfect." The gala was held in a ballroom lined with chandeliers, the air filled with the soft hum of conversation and music. Cameras flashed as they entered arm in arm, every head turning toward them. Ethan's hand rested gently at her waist, and though it was for the sake of appearances, it felt different this time. Protective, grounded, real. As they moved through the crowd, Lily handled the endless questions and compliments with grace that surprised even her. The whispers that had once followed her everywhere now softened. People were beginning to see her not as a mystery, but as a woman who belonged by his side. Later that evening, when the speeches were over and the orchestra played its final song, Ethan led her onto the dance floor. Neither of them spoke as the world blurred into lights and music around them. His hand found hers, and for the first time, the space between them felt like more than a performance. Lily could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under her fingertips, and it unsettled her. Not because she didn't like it, but because it made her wonder what would happen when these 7 months ended. When the music faded, they remained standing close, reluctant to step apart. It was Ethan who broke the spell, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked softly. "For making this easier than I expected."
For being
"You." The simplicity of his words struck her more deeply than any grand declaration could have. She smiled faintly, unsure what to say, so she simply nodded. But peace, as always, was fragile. The very next week, Ethan's past came crashing into their carefully built world. It began with a phone call. He was in his study late one night when the phone rang. On the other end was a voice he hadn't heard in years, soft, familiar, and laced with a hint of regret. "Ethan," the voice said. "It's Claire." Lily had never heard of Claire before, but she didn't need to be told who she was. She saw it in Ethan's eyes the next morning, the tension, the storm behind his calm. Claire was the ex-fiancée, the woman who had once promised him forever and left him when his life had become too big for love. Now she was back asking for forgiveness, claiming she had made a mistake. When Lily accidentally overheard fragments of their conversation one evening, her chest tightened. She had no right to feel anything. Jealousy wasn't part of their agreement. But emotions didn't follow contracts. That night she stayed in her room pretending to read while her heart battled logic. Ethan, on the other hand, was torn. Claire's sudden reappearance had stirred old wounds. But when he thought of Lily, her quiet strength, her unguarded laughter, her way of caring without expecting anything in return, he realized that whatever he had once felt for Claire had faded into memory. Still, the world wasn't blind. Rumors began to swirl. The tabloids hinted that Ethan was secretly meeting his ex-fiancée. Photographs surfaced of them at a cafe, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a hungry media. When Lily saw the headlines, her hands trembled. The pain that shot through her chest was sharp, irrational but real. She didn't confront him. Instead, she buried herself in silence, retreating behind the walls she had so carefully lowered over the past months. Ethan noticed the change immediately. The warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by a polite distance. Their dinners became quiet again, their laughter rare. Finally, one night, he cornered her gently in the hallway. "Lily," he said, his voice low, "talk to me." "What's going on?" "Nothing, Ethan," she said too quickly. "It's not my place." He stepped closer. "You think I owe her something, don't you?" "That I want her back." Lily looked away. "It's none of my business." "Maybe it isn't," he admitted. "But it feels like it is." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "She left when things got hard. You stayed when you didn't have to. That means something." Her eyes flickered to his, searching for truth. And in that moment, she saw it. Raw, unguarded honesty that no camera could capture. They stood there in silence, the air thick with all the words they couldn't say. And though neither of them moved, something shifted between them. Something fragile, precious and terrifying. That night, when Ethan returned to his study, he looked out at the city lights and realized that the woman he had married for convenience had become the one he couldn't imagine living without. But how could he tell her that when their marriage had an expiration date? And in her room, Lily sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, whispering to herself, "Don't fall for him. Don't forget what this is." But her heart, traitorous and wild, refused to listen. Neither of them knew that the coming months would bring challenges far greater than jealousy or doubt. Challenges that would test their strength, expose their truths, and force them to decide what love truly meant when money, pride, and fear were stripped away. The contract had begun as a deal between strangers. Now it was a fragile bond between two hearts learning to beat in rhythm, even when reason told them they shouldn't. The 4th month of their marriage arrived quietly. With the first whisper of winter, brushing against the windows of the penthouse. The days had grown shorter, and the city lights outside flickered like fireflies trapped in glass. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted once again, not into the cold distance of before, but into something heavier, more fragile, as though both Ethan and Lily were walking through fog, trying to find the shapes of feelings they could not name. Ethan's life had always been built on logic, on control, on making sure no one could ever use his heart against him again. But lately, control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Every time Lily smiled, every time her laughter filled the quiet corners of his world, every time she looked at him with that mixture of kindness and strength that was uniquely hers, he felt something breaking, something he wasn't sure he wanted to fix. The media storm surrounding Claire had not faded easily. Though Ethan had ended their conversation the same day it began, the paparazzi had feasted on the story of the return of the billionaire's lost love. Claire had been careful, crafting her image as a woman wronged by fate, painting herself as the one who had given up her happiness for Ethan's success. For days, the tabloids printed speculation, interviews with anonymous sources, and old photographs that blurred truth and memory into something toxic. Ethan had refused to engage, believing silence would end the rumors faster than denial. But he hadn't realized the damage his silence was doing to the person who mattered most. Lily endured it all quietly. The whispers, the pitying looks, the cruel headlines that called her a placeholder, a temporary distraction. She never complained, never confronted him, but he could feel the distance growing between them, the careful politeness replacing what had once been warmth. One evening, after another long day at work, Ethan found her sitting on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, her gaze lost in the endless sprawl of city lights. The wind tugged gently at her hair and the cold made her cheeks glow faintly pink. He hesitated before stepping out, unsure if his presence would comfort or disturb her. She didn't turn to look at him, but she knew he was there. She always did. "Are you still angry with me?" he asked quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the sound of the wind. "I was never angry," she said softly, still not meeting his eyes. "Just confused." He moved closer, leaning against the railing beside her. "About what?" "About where I fit in your world," she admitted after a pause. "I know this was never meant to be real. I know what we agreed. But sometimes, it feels like I don't know what's true anymore." Her words struck him like a blow because they mirrored his own confusion perfectly. He had promised himself from the beginning that this would remain a business arrangement, but somewhere between pretending and surviving, the lines had blurred beyond repair. He wanted to tell her that the rumors about Claire meant nothing, that the past had no hold over him anymore, that she was the only person who made him feel alive again. But the words refused to leave his lips. He was afraid not of losing her, but of admitting how much she mattered. "Lily," he began slowly, "Claire is the past. You have to believe me. I didn't bring her back into my life. She forced her way in through the media. But if I could take back every headline, every photo, I would, because I hate that it hurt you." She turned to him finally, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You don't owe me that, Ethan. We both knew what this was." "I know," he said softly, "but I still care." That confession lingered in the air between them like a secret neither of them was ready to unravel. Lily looked away, blinking back her emotions, and Ethan stood there beside her, wishing he could tell her everything he felt, the gratitude, the admiration, the love he was too afraid to name. The following weeks became a strange dance of closeness and restraint. There were moments when they almost forgot the contract entirely. Quiet breakfasts shared over coffee and laughter, evenings spent watching the city from the balcony in companionable silence, small gestures that spoke louder than words. But just when it seemed like peace had found them again, fate intervened in the cruelest way. It was a Monday morning when the call came. Lily had gone to visit her mother at the rehabilitation center, a weekly routine that had become her anchor. Ethan was in a board meeting when his phone buzzed repeatedly. The first message was from the hospital. Emergency, Mrs. Martinez, critical condition. The second was from Lily's number, though she wasn't the one typing. "This is Dr. Patel. Please come immediately." By the time Ethan reached the hospital, Lily was already there, standing in the hallway outside the ICU, her face pale, her hands trembling. The doctor's voice was a distant hum behind the glass, words like complications, heart failure, not responding. Ethan moved to her side instinctively, his arm going around her shoulders, but she barely seemed to register his presence. Her entire body was shaking, her eyes fixed on the small window into the room where her mother lay surrounded by machines. When the monitors finally went silent an hour later, the sound that came from Lily's throat was not a cry but a raw, broken gasp, the kind that carried every ounce of love and loss a heart could hold. Ethan held her as she collapsed into him, her tears soaking his shirt, his own chest tight with helplessness. He whispered her name over and over, not knowing what else to do. The woman who had held his world together with quiet strength was now breaking in his arms, and it tore something inside him beyond repair. The days that followed were a blur of grief. Ethan took care of everything, the funeral arrangements, the expenses, the paperwork. He did it silently without asking, because he knew Lily couldn't bear the weight of details just yet. He stood beside her during the small service, his hand finding hers when her voice failed as she said her final goodbye. The city outside continued its rhythm, cars honking, people rushing, life moving forward. But for them, time had stopped. That night, after the last of the guests had left and the candles had burned low, Lily sat alone in the living room of the penthouse, staring at a framed photo of her mother smiling. Her fingers brushed over the glass and her voice was barely a whisper. She was all I had. Ethan was standing in the doorway, watching her. Something inside him snapped. The restraint, the fear, the distance. He crossed the room in 2 strides, knelt beside her, and took her hand in his. "You still have me," he said, his voice trembling for the first time. Lily looked at him through her tears. "You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it because I have to," he said, his words coming out raw, unfiltered. "I'm saying it because it's true. I thought this arrangement would make my life easier, but it didn't. You didn't just save my inheritance, Lily, you saved me." The silence that followed was deafening. Lily's heart raced, torn between disbelief and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he meant every word. But before she could respond, his phone buzzed on the table beside them. He ignored it once, twice, but the third time it rang, the screen lit up with a name that shattered the fragile calm between them. Claire. Lily's expression faltered. Ethan's hesitation, the brief flicker of guilt in his eyes, was all it took. She pulled her hand away slowly, her voice breaking. "I can't do this right now. Lily, please, just give me space," she whispered. He wanted to explain, to tell her that Claire meant nothing, that the call was probably another desperate attempt to claw her way back into his life. But the look in Lily's eyes stopped him. It wasn't anger she felt, it was exhaustion. Too much loss, too much pain, too much confusion. She stood, walked to her room, and closed the door softly behind her. Ethan sank into the couch, running a hand through his hair, the sound of the closing door echoing like thunder in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. All his wealth, his control, his plans, none of it mattered when the one person who gave his life meaning was slipping away from him. The next morning, he found the penthouse quiet. Her room was neat, her things still there, but she wasn't. On the counter was a note written in her delicate handwriting. "I need time to heal, Ethan. I need to remember who I am without all of this. Please don't come looking for me, Lily." He stood there staring at the note, the words blurring as the ache in his chest deepened. For the first time since his grandfather's death, Ethan Ward felt truly alone. The empire he had built, the money, the fame, none of it could fill the silence she left behind. Lily, meanwhile, boarded a bus to a small coastal town 2 hours from the city. She needed air that didn't smell like steel and glass, needed to wake up somewhere that didn't remind her of contracts or cameras or grief. She rented a small room near the ocean, found work at a local cafe, and tried to rebuild herself piece by piece. But every night when she looked out at the sea, she thought of him, of the man who had begun as her employer, then her savior, then something far more dangerous, the keeper of her heart. And back in the city, Ethan stood by the same window where it had all begun, watching the rain blur the skyline once more. Only this time the silence was unbearable. He realized then that the fortune he had fought to protect meant nothing if it came at the cost of losing the only person who had ever truly seen him. The contract still had 2 months left. But what he wanted now had nothing to do with signatures or wealth. What he wanted and what he needed was her, not the version the world saw, not the role she had been paid to play, But the real Lily, the woman who had taught him what it meant to feel, and as the storm outside raged, Ethan made himself a silent promise he would find her, not because of a contract, but because for the first time in his life, love wasn't an obligation. It was the truth he could no longer deny. The winter wind swept through the city like an echo of everything Ethan Ward had lost. The penthouse that once symbolized power and perfection now felt hollow, its silence deafening. The rooms that used to hum with the soft rhythm of Lily's presence now lay still. Her laughter no longer drifted through the halls. Her quiet humming no longer filled the early mornings. Even the faint scent of her perfume, something soft like jasmine and warmth, had faded, leaving behind an emptiness that no amount of success could disguise. Ethan had always thought of himself as a man of control, but love, he realized, wasn't something you could build, negotiate, or contain. It was wild, unpredictable, and in his case, devastatingly real. For weeks after Lily's departure, Ethan buried himself in work, attending meetings, signing contracts, and facing board members who congratulated him for his latest merger, as if his world hadn't quietly fallen apart. But late at night, when the city's glow softened and the wind pressed against the glass like a whisper, his mind returned to her. He would picture her smile, her voice, the way she looked at him not as a billionaire but as a man. The note she had left still sat on his desk, its edges worn from the number of times he had unfolded it, searching for something, a clue, a sign, anything to tell him where she was. He could have found her easily. With his resources, locating one person was nothing. But the words she had written haunted him. "Please don't come looking for me." For the first time, Ethan decided to respect someone's absence rather than try to fill it. He had forced enough control into every part of his life. He would not force her return. Instead, he began to ask himself the question he had avoided for years. What do I have left when everything I built no longer matters? Meanwhile, far from the city, in a small seaside town, Lily found herself learning how to breathe again. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, its waves steady and unhurried, and for the first time in months the air didn't feel heavy. She rented a small apartment above a cafe where she worked as a server, her days simple but honest. Every morning she walked along the shoreline, the salt in the air stinging her eyes, her thoughts carried away by the rhythm of the sea. The grief for her mother was still there, a quiet ache she carried everywhere, but beneath it something else began to stir. Peace. Yet even peace could not erase memory. Some nights, as she watched the sunset bleed into the water, she would remember Ethan, the way he had held her after her mother's funeral, the sincerity in his voice when he said, "You saved me." She would remember how his eyes softened when he smiled at her, how the walls around him seemed to crumble, how his silence had once felt safer than words, and then she would remember the sound of Claire's name flashing across his phone screen, and remind herself why she had left. Love was not supposed to feel uncertain, she told herself, not supposed to be something you had to question. But deep down she also knew that what she had felt for Ethan had been real. Months passed. The contract's expiration date crept closer. 7 months since the day their names had been signed together. 7 months since the moment their lives had changed. And then, one late afternoon, the past came knocking. Lily was closing the cafe when a familiar voice startled her from behind. "I thought I might find you here." She froze. Slowly she turned, and there he was, Ethan. His hair was slightly longer, his face thinner, his suit replaced by something more casual. But his eyes, those unmistakable eyes, held the same mix of strength and vulnerability she remembered. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The only sound was the ocean outside and the faint clink of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. "How did you find me?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't," he said simply. "I waited. I thought I was respecting your wish to disappear, but waiting became unbearable. So I asked myself what you'd do if you wanted to start over, and I came here." She blinked, unsure what to say. "You shouldn't have come." "Maybe not," he admitted, taking a hesitant step closer, "but I needed to see you. Not to ask you to come back. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For not protecting you from the rumors. For not saying what I should have said when I had the chance." Lily's breath caught. "Ethan, you don't owe me anything. What we had was never meant to last." He shook his head slowly. "That's where you're wrong. What we had, it was the only real thing in my life. You think it began with a contract, but it didn't. It began the moment I saw you crying in that hallway and realized that for all my money, I couldn't fix what was breaking inside you. But you fixed me without even trying." Her eyes filled with tears she had sworn she wouldn't shed. "You can't say things like that. You had Claire, your company, your whole world. You don't need me." He closed the distance between them now, his voice trembling with the truth he had kept buried too long. "You're wrong again. I had everything, but none of it mattered. I kept thinking I needed to save my fortune to honor my grandfather's legacy. But the truth is, I was saving the wrong thing. The legacy I want to keep is what you gave me, the courage to be human again." Lily's heart raced. The cafe's lights glowed softly around them, the ocean whispering through the open window. Everything inside her warred between fear and longing. She wanted to believe him, but believing meant risking everything all over again. "Ethan," she said quietly, "when I left, I told myself it was because I needed space to heal. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that what I felt for you was one-sided. Afraid that once the contract ended, I'd just be another chapter in your story." He reached for her hand gently, as if touching something sacred. "Then let me prove it's not a chapter. Let me make it the story." For a long moment, she just stared at him, trying to read his sincerity. But the look in his eyes, raw, unguarded, desperate in its honesty, left no room for doubt. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders melting into something softer. "You always know what to say, don't you?" she murmured. He smiled faintly. "Only when I finally stopped thinking." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of everything they had left unsaid, full of forgiveness and understanding. Then, without planning, without permission, Ethan stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her. The world outside vanished, replaced by the sound of her heartbeat against his chest. It wasn't the kind of kiss that belonged in fairy tales or movies. It was simple, honest, full of everything they had endured, a promise not of perfection but of something real. The days that followed were different. Ethan stayed in the small town for a while, helping at the cafe, trading suits for rolled-up sleeves. The people there treated him like anyone else, which amused Lily endlessly. They would walk by the shore at dusk, talking about the future not in terms of contracts or deadlines, but dreams. He confessed that he had stepped down as CEO, handing control of his empire to his most trusted partner. "I realized," he told her one evening as they sat watching the waves, "that I don't want to build companies anymore. I want to build a life." Lily smiled softly. "And what does that life look like?" He turned to her, eyes reflecting the sunset. "It looks like this. You, me, the sound of the ocean, and a peace I didn't know existed until I met you." For the first time in a long time, Lily laughed, a real laugh, light and free. "You sound like a poet, Mr. Ward," he grinned. "I guess love makes even businessmen poetic." When they returned to the city months later, it wasn't for the inheritance or the headlines. Ethan didn't care what the world thought anymore. The tabloids eventually lost interest, and Claire faded back into the shadows of gossip columns. What remained was what mattered. Two people who had met through circumstance but stayed through choice. On the day their marriage contract was set to expire, Ethan invited Lily to the rooftop of the penthouse, the same place where their story had quietly begun. The city stretched out beneath them, glowing golden in the evening light. A small table stood at the center, a bouquet of white lilies resting on it, and beside it a new envelope. Lily looked at him curiously. "What's this?" He handed her the envelope. Inside was a document, not a contract this time, but a letter. It read simply, "This is not an agreement. It's a promise. No expiration, no signatures, just love." Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him. "Ethan." He smiled softly, his voice steady. "Lily Martinez, will you marry me again?" "No conditions. No contracts. Just because I can't imagine a life without you." Her answer was a whisper against the wind, but it was enough. Yes. As they stood there, the world below them carrying on, cars moving, lights flickering, lives unfolding, their story came full circle. It had begun as a transaction between two broken souls and ended as a testament to what love could rebuild when given the chance. Years later, people would still whisper about Ethan Ward, the billionaire who walked away from his empire for a woman no one had ever heard of. But those who saw them together would understand. Because sometimes the greatest success isn't in what you own or build, but in the peace you find when you finally stop running from what your heart already knew, and in the quiet of their home, where laughter once again filled the halls. Ethan would often tell Lily as they watched the rain fall across the glass, "I thought my grandfather cursed me with that will, but he didn't. He gave me the one thing money couldn't buy, the chance to find you." Lily would smile, her fingers entwined with his, and whisper, "Then maybe fate isn't cruel after all." Outside, the rain would fall softly against the windows, not as a symbol of sadness this time, but of life, renewal, and beginnings. The story that started with desperation and a contract had ended with love, pure, lasting, and free. The end.